February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima. The air tastes like sulfur and salt. Black volcanic sand clings to everything. Rifles, skin, the folds of sweat-soaked uniforms. A young Marine corporal crouches behind a shattered outcrop of rock, breathing hard. His name is Eddie Moran, 23 years old. Chicago. 2 days on this island and it feels like 2 lifetimes. Above him the sky screams. Artillery shells arc toward Mount Suribachi, throwing columns of dirt skyward. But the bunkers don't die. They never die. Pillboxes embedded in the ridgeline keep firing. Machine gun nests carved into stone swallow smoke grenades whole and spit bullets back. Moran reaches into his pack. Past the ammunition. Past the canteen. His fingers find something waxy, smooth. A pack of crayons, Crayola, 8 colors. His daughter's. She'd slipped them in before he shipped out. "So you don't forget what colors look like, Daddy." He stares at them. Then at the bunker 200 yards upslope, the one that killed his lieutenant an hour ago, and he gets an idea. By February 1945, the Pacific War had become a grinding mathematics of blood and stone. The island-hopping campaign, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, had taught the United States Marine Corps a brutal lesson. Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved into something monstrous. No longer did enemy forces contest beaches with banzai charges. They waited. They buried themselves in the earth. And they killed from positions so hardened, so ingeniously concealed, that conventional firepower often failed entirely. Iwo Jima represented the apex of this nightmare. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash, honeycombed with 11 miles of tunnels. Major General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months preparing defenses that rejected every assumption American planners held. Bunkers were reinforced with steel, concrete, and layered sandbags. Firing apertures were angled to create interlocking fields of fire. Entire artillery pieces were buried with only their barrels exposed, and every position had multiple escape routes through the tunnel network, allowing defenders to vanish and reappear elsewhere. The pre-invasion bombardment, 3 days of naval gunfire, had been the longest in Pacific War history. Battleships and cruisers hurled 14,000 shells at the island. Carrier aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. Intelligence officers assured commanders that defenses would be shattered. They were wrong. When the first wave of Marines hit the beaches on the morning of February 19th, they discovered that Kuribayashi's bunkers had survived almost intact. Machine guns opened up from positions that were supposed to be obliterated. Mortar fire rained from caves that weren't even on the maps. Within hours, the beach was a killing ground. Men clawed through black sand that swallowed boots to the ankle. Amphibious tractors burned. Wounded Marines drowned in the surf, too heavy with gear to crawl to safety. The Marines advanced anyway. They always did. But progress was measured in yards per hour, and the cost was unspeakable. Every pillbox required flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades, and close-range rifle fire. Even then, many bunkers had to be attacked. Multiple times because tunnel networks allowed defenders to reoccupy them after Marine units moved forward. Air support was available. Corsairs and Hellcats from escort carriers offshore. Artillery batteries were being hauled up the beaches and emplaced despite enemy fire. But coordinating strikes was chaos. The island was too small, the fighting too close. Forward observers radioed coordinates, but smoke from burning wreckage obscured landmarks. Radio traffic was jammed with desperate calls for ammunition, plasma, reinforcements. Pilots circled overhead, willing to help, but unable to distinguish friend from foe through the haze. Smoke grenades, the standard method for marking targets, proved nearly useless. Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain created unpredictable wind patterns. Colored smoke dispersed instantly or drifted into Marine positions, confusing pilots. White phosphorus was too dangerous at close range. Tracer rounds from rifles could indicate general directions, but lacked precision for bunkers embedded in cliff faces or buried beneath rubble. And so men died clearing bunkers that artillery could have destroyed. If only the gunners could see them. Corsairs flew overhead with rockets and bombs, desperate to help, but unwilling to drop ordnance when the target was a guess. The problem was not new. It had plagued Marine operations since Guadalcanal. The Corps had built its reputation on combined arms, the seamless integration of infantry, artillery, armor, and close air support. In training, on the ranges at Camp Pendleton and Quantico, it worked beautifully. Forward observers called coordinates. Shells landed. Targets died. Clean, efficient, doctrinal, but the Pacific refused to cooperate with doctrine. Jungle canopy hid everything. Coral ridges resembled each other. Maps were based on outdated surveys or aerial photos that showed none of the hidden fortifications. Radio equipment, battered by salt water and humidity, failed at critical moments. Batteries died. Antennas were shot away. And even when communication worked, describing a target's location verbally, under fire, disoriented, exhausted, was nearly impossible. Some units tried using colored panels to mark friendly positions, hoping pilots could deduce enemy locations by contrast. But panels were bulky, difficult to deploy under fire, and often invisible from altitude depending on angle and light. Others experimented with signal mirrors, but these required direct sunlight and steady hands, luxuries rarely available in combat. Flares seemed promising. Pyrotechnic signals could mark targets day or night, but they burned out in seconds and produced more smoke, adding to the visual confusion. Worse, they advertised the forward observer's position to every enemy gunner within sight, making follow-up observations suicidal. The Marines tried adapting tank infantry tactics, using Shermans to suppress bunkers while infantry closed in. But Iwo Jima's volcanic ash immobilized armor within yards of the beach. Tanks bogged down, through tracks, became stationary targets for Japanese anti-tank guns. Some were abandoned. Others were destroyed. The few that reached firm ground were funneled into narrow routes, where they could be engaged from multiple concealed positions. At night, the island belonged to the Japanese. Infiltrators moved through the tunnel networks, emerging behind Marine lines to attack command posts, supply dumps, and artillery positions. Sentries shot at shadows. Friendly fire incidents spiked. Sleep became impossible. Dawn brought relief, but also renewed assaults on bunkers that seemed to regenerate overnight. Battalion commanders grew desperate. Every hour of delay meant more casualties. Every bunker that survived another day was a bunker that would kill more Marines tomorrow. Regimental and division-level officers demanded faster progress, but there was no doctrine for this. No manual chapter titled, "Destroying Positions That Shouldn't Exist." Junior officers and NCOs, the sergeants and lieutenants doing the actual fighting, began improvising. Some teams used white tape to mark bunker entrances, hoping aerial observers would notice. Others tried using field telephones to establish direct links with spotter planes, bypassing jammed radio nets. A few enterprising units sent runners back to the beach to physically guide pilots to targets, a method that worked occasionally but was impossibly slow, and casualties mounted. By the end of the second day, the 28th Marines, tasked with capturing Mount Suribachi, had taken 40% losses in some companies. Corpsmen ran out of morphine. Aid stations overflowed. The beach evacuation zone, already clogged with wounded, became a second battlefield as Japanese artillery continued to target it. It was in this cauldron of frustration, exhaustion, and mounting death that innovation became survival. Not from staff officers in rear headquarters, not from training manuals or tactical schools, but from the men in the sand, the ones close enough to see the problem and desperate enough to try anything. One of those men was Eddie Moran, and he was staring at a box of crayons. Lieutenant Michael Novak had been a forward observer for 9 months. Tarawa, Saipan. Now, Iwo Jima. He'd watched men die, because he couldn't make himself understood, because the words he shouted into the radio handset. Bunker, 50 meters east of the volcanic cone, 2-story rock formation, meant nothing to a pilot at 3,000 feet who saw 50 rock formations. He'd watched Corsairs drop bombs 200 yards from intended targets, watched artillery land in empty craters while bunkers 10 yards away kept firing. Once, on Saipan, he'd directed naval gunfire onto a machine gun nest, only to have the destroyer's 5-inch shells land squarely on a Marine platoon he hadn't known was there. He'd screamed corrections, but by the time the next salvo adjusted, the bunker's crew had escaped through a tunnel. Novak carried that platoon with him. 11 men. He knew some of their names. He'd helped bag their bodies. On Iwo Jima, the problem multiplied. The island was too small, too chaotic, too obscured by smoke and dust. He'd call in strikes and watch shells land. Somewhere. Sometimes they hit. Often they didn't. And every miss was ammunition wasted, time lost, and Marines who had to assault bunkers that should have been rubble. He started having dreams. In them, he could reach through the radio and physically point at targets. Grab the pilot's hand. Guide the bomb. But he'd wake to the reality of static, coordinates, verbal descriptions that dissolved into confusion. On the third day, Corporal Moran approached him, showed him the crayons, explained the idea in 3 sentences. Novak stared at the box. Crayola. Burnt sienna. Carnation pink. Jungle green. He almost laughed. Then he thought about the 11 men on Saipan. "Let's try it," he said. The ANPRC-10 radio, standard issue for forward observers, was a marvel of engineering in theory. Frequency modulation, 5-watt transmitter. Range of 3 miles under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions did not include volcanic ash infiltrating every seal, saltwater corrosion from surf landings, and batteries that drained in hours under the strain of constant transmission. Radios failed daily. Some simply died. Others crackled with interference from nearby sets, creating a cacophony where critical messages drowned in noise. And even functioning radios required the observer to articulate target locations using grid coordinates derived from maps that were, at best, approximations. Grid coordinates assumed landmarks. But landmarks on Iwo Jima were obliterated within hours. The twisted tree mentioned in morning briefings was splinters by noon. The concrete wall was indistinguishable rubble by evening. Observers resorted to compass bearings and estimated distances, but these were subjective, especially under fire, especially when exhausted. Smoke grenades, ANM-8, burned for 2 minutes and produced colored smoke visible for miles, except when wind scattered it in seconds, except when multiple units used smoke simultaneously, creating a rainbow haze that marked nothing, except when smoke drifted over friendly positions, causing pilots to abort runs for fear of hitting Marines. Tracer ammunition seemed logical. Fire at the bunker. Let the pilot follow the tracers. But tracers burned out after a few hundred meters. At aircraft speeds, that flicker was invisible, and firing tracers toward a bunker drew immediate return fire, often killing the observer before aircraft could arrive. Parachute flares worked at night, but were useless in daylight. Star shells illuminated areas but not specific targets. Even when everything worked, there remained the fundamental problem. A pilot traveling at 200 miles per hour, focusing on not crashing, had seconds to identify a target described by someone on the ground who might not even be looking at the same terrain feature. Technology had not caught up to the problem. Laser designators were decades away. GPS didn't exist. Even the concept of precision-guided munitions was science fiction in 1945. What Marines needed was something simple, visible, unmistakable. Something that said, "This, right here. Destroy this." They needed crayons. Eddie Moran hadn't planned to be a forward observer. He was a rifleman, 2nd Battalion, 27th Marines. But riflemen did whatever needed doing, and when Lieutenant Novak's radio man took shrapnel to the chest on D+2, Moran was nearby, functional, and could carry the radio. He'd never told anyone about the crayons. It was embarrassing. A 23-year-old Marine carrying children's art supplies into combat. But his daughter, Emma, 4 years old, had been insistent. She'd drawn him a picture the night before he left. Stick figures, a house, a yellow sun. She'd made him promise to draw her one back. "So I know you're okay, Daddy." He'd kept the crayons. Through training, through the ship crossing, through the terror of the landing. They were stupid, useless, sentimental. But they were also hers, and letting them go felt like letting her go. On the morning of D+3, pinned behind rocks while a Japanese bunker raked their position, Moran was searching his pack for a fresh canteen when his hand closed around the crayon box. He pulled it out, looked at it, looked at the bunker. The bunker was gray concrete, barely visible against the volcanic rock. Smoke from previous bombardments drifted across it. From the air, it would be invisible. But what if it wasn't gray? Moran turned to Novak, pitched the idea. Novak was skeptical. Reasonably so. But desperation makes people open-minded. How would we mark it? I'll crawl forward. Make a big X on the front, red or orange. Something that stands out. You'll get killed. Maybe. But if this works, fewer people get killed tomorrow. Novak chewed that over. Then nodded. Moran took the red crayon, left his rifle, crawled. Wax crayons are chemically inert, non-toxic, and designed for maximum color saturation. Crayola's formulations used pigments suspended in paraffin wax, creating marks that were visible under almost any lighting condition. Red and orange crayons contained iron oxide and cadmium pigments, compounds that reflected light intensely in the visible spectrum. On gray concrete or black volcanic rock, these colors produced contrast ratios exceeding 70%. From an aircraft at 2,000 feet, a 12-inch crayon mark was distinguishable in clear conditions. More importantly, crayon wax did not disperse, evaporate, or blow away. Once applied, it stayed. This was not sophisticated technology. It was kindergarten physics, but it worked precisely because it was simple. A pilot didn't need to interpret coordinates, estimate distances, or identify obscured features. He saw a bright red X. That was the target. Everything else was noise. The technique exploited human visual psychology. The eye is drawn to high-contrast anomalies. A red mark on a gray bunker triggered immediate recognition, faster than conscious thought. Pilots didn't have to search. The target announced itself. Additionally, crayon marks were unambiguous. Smoke could mean many things. A destroyed tank, a signal, residual bombardment. A crayon X meant only one thing. Bomb this. There was no confusion, no second-guessing. Of course, applying the marks required someone to get close enough to the bunker to physically draw on it. That meant crawling through fire zones, exposed, vulnerable. It was insane. But so was assaulting a bunker blind while aircraft circled uselessly overhead. When Corporal Moran returned from marking the first bunker, alive, somehow, though his uniform was shredded and his hands were bleeding, Lieutenant Novak radioed the coordinates to a Corsair flight circling offshore. But he also added something unofficial to the transmission. Target marked with red X. Visual identification. Look for the red X. There was a pause. Then the pilot's voice, skeptical and confused. Say again, red X. Affirmative. Crayon mark on the bunker face. You'll see it. Another pause. Then, understood. Coming in. Novak and Moran watched from cover. The Corsair banked, descended, lined up its approach. For a moment it seemed to hesitate. Then it dove. A 500-pound bomb detached, fell, struck. The bunker disintegrated. Concrete, steel, fire. The explosion echoed across the ridgeline. The pilot's voice crackled back. Target destroyed. That crayon thing. Do it again. Word spread through the battalion within hours. Not through official channels. There was no time for reports. But through the grapevine, every combat unit develops. Marines talked. Officers listened. By evening, other forward observers were asking Moran if he had more crayons. He didn't. But someone did. A supply sergeant on the beach, scrounging through personal effects from casualties, found 3 more boxes. He sent them forward. Battalion commanders noticed the change. Suddenly, airstrikes were hitting with precision. Bunkers marked in the morning were rubble by afternoon. The 27th Marines' advance accelerated. Other regiments asked what had changed. When Colonel Thomas Warnham, commanding the 27th, learned the answer, he reportedly laughed. Then he stopped laughing and said, "Get me every crayon on this island." There was no official order, No typed directive from division headquarters. But staff officers began making inquiries. Supply ships were queried. Did anyone have crayons in inventory? Care packages from home were searched. A chaplain donated a box his congregation had sent for distributing to local children, if they ever found any. Within 3 days, the technique had spread to adjacent units. By D+5, forward observers across the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions were carrying crayons. Some units painted rocks, others marked cloth panels. One innovative sergeant filled a sock with crushed crayon wax and hurled it at a bunker, creating a vivid splatter visible from altitude. Senior officers, colonels and generals, remained ambivalent. It was embarrassing, undignified. Marines were supposed to employ cutting-edge combined arms doctrine, not kindergarten supplies. But results silenced criticism. Casualty rates in sectors using crayon marking dropped measurably compared to those relying on traditional methods. Nobody wrote it into the manual, but everyone did it anyway. The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima operated under a doctrine called Gyokusai, honorable death. Surrender was unthinkable. Retreat was forbidden. Every man was expected to kill 10 Americans before dying. And for the first days of battle, this seemed achievable. Their bunkers were masterpieces, reinforced to withstand naval bombardment, camouflaged to blend with volcanic terrain, positioned to create crossfires that turned Marine advances into massacres. Tunnel networks allowed them to reoccupy positions after American units passed, forcing the same ground to be fought over repeatedly. They watched the Marines struggle, saw them attack bunkers with flamethrowers, explosives, sheer desperate courage, watched them die by the hundreds, and they knew they were winning, even in defeat. Even if the island eventually fell, the cost they imposed would make America reconsider invading Japan itself. But on the 3rd day, something changed. Bunkers that had survived days of bombardment suddenly exploded with surgical precision. Artillery shells landed directly on firing apertures. Aircraft bombs struck bunkers nobody thought the Americans had even located. Positions that should have been invisible were being destroyed systematically. The Japanese didn't understand. Had American intelligence improved? Were there infiltrators? Some defenders reported seeing Americans crawling close to bunkers, then retreating. But they assumed these were reconnaissance patrols or failed satchel charge attempts. They never saw the marks. Or if they did, they dismissed them as accidental scuffs, meaningless damage. Who would notice a red streak on a bunker in the chaos of battle? By the time they realized the marks were deliberate targets, it was too late. Bunkers across the island were already painted, and the aircraft kept coming. In post-war interrogations, surviving Japanese officers expressed confusion about the sudden shift in American accuracy. Some attributed it to radar or secret technology. None mentioned crayons. They'd been marked for death by children's toys, and they never knew. February 22, 1945. Dawn. The 28th Marines had taken Mount Suribachi the day before, the iconic flag raising photographed by Joe Rosenthal. But the rest of Iwo Jima remained a fortress. The second airfield was contested. The northern plateau, where Kuribayashi's command bunker lay hidden, was untouched, and the ground between was seeded with hundreds of bunkers, pillboxes, and spider holes. The 3rd Marine Division, pushing toward Airfield No. 2, had stalled. A ridgeline designated Hill 199 blocked their advance. Intelligence estimated 15 to 20 bunkers and fortified caves along its slopes. Preliminary bombardment had accomplished nothing. Infantry assaults had been shredded. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Jumping Joe Chambers, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, was briefed on the crayon technique by a forward observer who'd spoken with someone from the 27th. Chambers was skeptical, but desperate. His battalion had been mauling itself against Hill 199 for 2 days. "Crayons," he said flatly. "Yes, sir." "And this works?" "It worked on Suribachi, sir," Chambers considered. "Then, do it. Mark every goddamn bunker you can reach." The operation began at 600. 3 teams of volunteers, 2 men each, crawled forward under covering fire. They carried Thompson submachine guns and boxes of crayons. Red, orange, yellow. Colors that screamed against gray stone. The first bunker was 30 yards from Marine lines. Private First Class Robert Dunham and Corporal James Chavez low-crawled through volcanic ash, moving inches at a time. Machine gun fire stitched the air above them. Mortar rounds impacted randomly, throwing grit into their faces. It took them 20 minutes to cover 30 yards. When they reached the bunker, Dunham pulled out a red crayon and drew a crude X across the firing slit. His hand shook. The wax skipped across rough concrete, but the mark was visible, bright, unmistakable. They crawled back. Somehow, both survived. The second team marked a pillbox embedded in the hillside. The third team reached a cave entrance and painted a large red circle around it before scrambling to safety. By 07:30, 6 targets were marked. Forward Air Controller Lieutenant Raymond Stone radioed the escort carrier, Bismarck C, requesting close air support. 4 Corsairs launched. Stone gave them the situation. Targets marked with red or orange crayon. Visual identification only. Friendlies within 100 yards. The Corsairs arrived at 07:45. They made a first pass, low and slow, identifying marks. Then they climbed, rolled, and dove. The first bunker, Dunham's bunker, took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. The explosion blew debris 200 feet into the air. The structure collapsed inward, sealing the occupants inside. The second Corsair fired rockets into the pillbox. 8 5-inch HVARs struck in sequence. The pillbox disintegrated. The third and fourth aircraft dropped bombs on the cave entrance, triggering a secondary explosion that suggested an ammunition store inside. Smoke and flame vented from fissures across the hillside. 3 minutes. 3 targets destroyed. Stone called in artillery. Marine 105mm howitzers, guided by the crayon marks visible through binoculars, walked shells across the ridgeline. Bunkers unmarked by crayons were targeted using traditional methods, with predictably poor results. But the marked bunkers died. By 08:30, 10 bunkers had been destroyed. Chambers ordered his battalion forward. They advanced behind the barrage, meeting lighter resistance than any assault in the past 2 days. Marines reached positions that had been impregnable and found them shattered, abandoned, or filled with dead defenders who'd had no chance to escape. The second wave of marking teams went out at 0900. More volunteers, more crayons. By noon, 15 bunkers bore bright marks. By 1400, 20 aircraft rotated constantly. Corsairs from Bismarck C and Anzio took turns bombing marked targets. Pilots reported that the system was faster and more intuitive than any previous method. One pilot radioed, "Finally, a target I can actually see." Artillery forward observers used the marks to adjust fire without needing radio confirmation from infantry. They could see the targets. If the shells landed near the bright marks, they were on target. If not, adjust. The psychological effect on Marines was profound. For days, they'd assaulted bunkers with no confidence that support would arrive, that bombs would land accurately, that their calls for help would result in anything but wasted ordnance. Now they watched bunkers explode precisely where they were marked. It felt like having a guardian angel with perfect aim. By 1600 hours, February 22nd, the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines had destroyed 23 bunkers using the crayon marking technique. Hill 199 was secure. Casualties were a fraction of what they'd been on previous assaults. Chambers stood on the ridgeline, looking at the rubble. Somewhere in the wreckage was a red crayon mark, scorched but still visible. He later wrote in his after-action report, "Unconventional methods proved decisive where doctrine failed." He didn't mention crayons by name, but everyone knew. February 22, 1945. Dawn. The 28th Marines had taken Mount Suribachi the day before, the iconic flag-raising photographed by Joe Rosenthal. But the rest of Iwo Jima remained a fortress. The second airfield was contested. The northern plateau, where Kurabayashi's command bunker lay hidden, was untouched, and the ground between was seeded with hundreds of bunkers, pillboxes, and spider holes. The 3rd Marine Division, pushing toward Airfield No. 2, had stalled. A ridgeline designated Hill 199 blocked their advance. Intelligence estimated 15 to 20 bunkers and fortified caves along its slopes. Preliminary bombardment had accomplished nothing. Infantry assaults had been shredded. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Jumping Joe Chambers, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, was briefed on the crayon technique by a forward observer who'd spoken with someone from the 27th. Chambers was skeptical but desperate. His battalion had been mauling itself against Hill 199 for 2 days. "Crayons," he said flatly. "Yes, sir. And this works?" "It worked on Suribachi, sir," Chambers considered. "Then, do it. Mark every goddamn bunker you can reach." The operation began at 600. 3 teams of volunteers, 2 men each, crawled forward under covering fire. They carried Thompson submachine guns and boxes of crayons. Red, orange, yellow, colors that screamed against gray stone. The first bunker was 30 yards from Marine lines. Private First Class Robert Dunham and Corporal James Chavez low-crawled through volcanic ash, moving inches at a time. Machine gun fire stitched the air above them. Mortar rounds impacted randomly, throwing grit into their faces. It took them 20 minutes to cover 30 yards. When they reached the bunker, Dunham pulled out a red crayon and drew a crude X across the firing slit. His hand shook. The wax skipped across rough concrete, but the mark was visible, bright, unmistakable. They crawled back. Somehow both survived. The second team marked a pillbox embedded in the hillside. The third team reached a cave entrance and painted a large red circle around it before scrambling to safety. By 0730, 6 targets were marked. Forward Air Controller Lieutenant Raymond Stone radioed the escort carrier Bismarck C, requesting close air support. 4 Corsairs launched. Stone gave them the situation. Targets marked with red or orange crayon. Visual identification only. Friendlies within 100 yards. The Corsairs arrived at Iwo 745. They made a first pass, low and slow, identifying marks. Then they climbed, rolled, and dove. The first bunker, Dunham's bunker, took a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. The explosion blew debris 200 feet into the air. The structure collapsed inward, sealing the occupants inside. The second Corsair fired rockets into the pillbox. 8 5-inch HVARs struck in sequence. The pillbox disintegrated. The third and fourth aircraft dropped bombs on the cave entrance, triggering a secondary explosion that suggested an ammunition store inside. Smoke and flame vented from fissures across the hillside. 3 minutes. 3 targets destroyed. Stone called in artillery. Marine 105mm howitzers, guided by the crayon marks visible through binoculars, walked shells across the ridgeline. Bunkers unmarked by crayons were targeted using traditional methods, with predictably poor results. But the marked bunkers died. By 0830, 10 bunkers had been destroyed. Chambers ordered his battalion forward. They advanced behind the barrage, meeting lighter resistance than any assault in the past 2 days. Marines reached positions that had been impregnable and found them shattered, abandoned, or filled with dead defenders who'd had no chance to escape. The second wave of marking teams went out at 0900. More volunteers, more crayons. By noon, 15 bunkers bore bright marks. By 1420, aircraft rotated constantly. Corsairs from Bismarck C and Enzio took turns bombing marked targets. Pilots reported that the system was faster and more intuitive than any previous method. One pilot radioed, "Finally, a target I can actually see." Artillery forward observers used the marks to adjust fire without needing radio confirmation from infantry. They could see the targets. If the shells landed near the bright marks, they were on target. If not, adjust. The psychological effect on Marines was profound. For days they'd assaulted bunkers with no confidence that support would arrive, that bombs would land accurately, that their calls for help would result in anything but wasted ordnance. Now they watched bunkers explode precisely where they were marked. It felt like having a guardian angel with perfect aim. By 1600 hours, February 27th, The 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines had destroyed 23 bunkers using the crayon marking technique. Hill 199 was secure. Casualties were a fraction of what they'd been on previous assaults. Chambers stood on the ridgeline, looking at the rubble. Somewhere in the wreckage was a red crayon mark, scorched but still visible. He later wrote in his after-action report, "Unconventional methods proved decisive where doctrine failed." He didn't mention crayons by name, but everyone knew. The success at Hill 199 spread like wildfire. Other battalions demanded crayons. Supply officers scoured ships, beachheads, even personal lockers. One enterprising quartermaster radioed a supply depot in Hawaii, requesting an emergency shipment of crayons. The request was initially denied as absurd, until a colonel intervened, having heard what was happening on Iwo Jima. By February 23rd, crayon marking had become semi-official. Forward air controllers received verbal instructions. Prioritize targets with visible markings. Artillery liaisons were told to trust visual confirmation from observers over radio coordinates when possible. The technique evolved. Marines discovered that orange and yellow worked better on dark surfaces, while red excelled on lighter concrete. Some units began using multiple colors to indicate priority. Red for immediate destruction, orange for secondary targets, yellow for suspected positions requiring reconnaissance. A few creative teams experimented with shapes, X's for bunkers, circles for cave entrances, arrows pointing to hidden firing slits. Pilots quickly learned the visual language, but the method required courage bordering on insanity. Marking a bunker meant crawling within feet of enemy positions. It meant exposing yourself for minutes while you scrawled on concrete under fire. Many volunteers didn't survive. Private First Class Dunham, who'd marked the first bunker on Hill 199, volunteered for 5 more marking runs over the next 3 days. On his 6th attempt, he was shot by a sniper while painting a red X. He died before corpsmen could reach him. The bunker he'd marked was destroyed 10 minutes later by a Corsair. Corporal Chavez, Dunham's partner, continued marking bunkers alone. He survived Iwo Jima. He never spoke about the crayons after the war, but he kept a red crayon in his pocket for the rest of his life. The Japanese began to understand. By February 24th, defenders noticed the marks. Some tried scrubbing them off, but crayon wax was stubborn, and they had no solvents. Others realized that marked bunkers were doomed and abandoned them, retreating into tunnel networks. A few Japanese officers attempted counter-tactics. They marked random rocks with mud or ash, hoping to draw American fire away from real bunkers. But the deception failed. Pilots learned to recognize the distinct color and texture of crayon marks versus natural staining. One Japanese lieutenant, captured near the end of the battle, asked his interrogators what the colored marks meant. When told, he reportedly shook his head and said, in broken English, "Children's paint. You killed us with children's paint." By February 26th, the northern plateau assaults began. The terrain was even worse than Suribachi, a maze of ravines, boulders, and fortifications. But Marines now had a method. Mark, bomb, advance, repeat. The 9th Marines marked and destroyed 18 bunkers in a single day. The 21st Marines cleared a ravine system, dubbed Death Valley by the men, using crayons and close air support. Positions that would have cost hundreds of lives fell with minimal casualties. Not every marked bunker was destroyed. Some airstrikes missed. Some artillery rounds fell short. But the success rate was exponentially higher than anything achieved in the first days of battle. On February 28th, a staff officer from V Amphibious Corps headquarters visited frontline units to assess the crayon technique. He interviewed forward observers, pilots, and infantry officers. His report concluded, "Marking targets with colored wax enables visual identification with 70–80% reliability, compared to 20–30% for radio-coordinated strikes. Recommend immediate adoption across all Marine divisions." But the recommendation was redundant. Marines were already using crayons everywhere they could get them. Supply clerks noted an unprecedented demand for art supplies. One shipment of crayons, originally destined for a recreation program in Hawaii, was diverted to Iwo Jima. By early March, as the battleground toward its conclusion, thousands of bunkers bore crayon marks, some destroyed, some still being targeted, some abandoned by defenders who'd realized they were marked for death. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, black and gray and lifeless, was now splashed with red, orange, and yellow, a child's rainbow painted across hell. And it worked. Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945, though pockets of resistance continued for weeks. The battle cost 6,031 American lives and over 19,000 wounded. Nearly all 21,000 Japanese defenders died. It was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. But casualty statistics obscured a critical detail. Losses declined significantly after the crayon marking technique became widespread. Battalions employing the method reported 30–40% fewer casualties during bunker assaults compared to earlier operations. Air and artillery support became dramatically more effective, reducing the need for direct infantry assaults on fortified positions. Medical officers noted the change. Corpsmen treating wounded Marines observed that fewer injuries came from bunker assaults after February 22. More casualties resulted from snipers, mortars, and cave-clearing operations. Dangerous, but less catastrophic than frontal attacks on pillboxes. The technique saved lives. How many is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggest hundreds of Marines survived assaults that would have been suicidal using conventional methods. After Iwo Jima, the Marine Corps conducted formal reviews. The crayon marking method was mentioned in multiple after-action reports, though often obliquely. Some officers seemed embarrassed to acknowledge that something so crude had succeeded where sophisticated doctrine failed. Others praised the innovation openly. A training bulletin issued in April 1945 included a section on improvised target marking methods, mentioning colored materials including wax crayons. It was not a formal doctrinal change, just a suggestion. But every forward observer in the Pacific read it. When Marines landed on Okinawa on April 1, 1945, crayons were in the supply lists, not officially requisitioned but present nonetheless. Units carried them alongside ammunition and rations, and when they encountered Japanese bunkers, less formidable than Iwo Jima's but still deadly, they used the crayons. Okinawa's terrain was different. Rolling hills, vegetation, caves carved into limestone rather than volcanic rock. But the principle held. Mark the target. Call the strike. Watch it die. Pilots over Okinawa quickly learned to look for the colored marks. Corsairs, Hellcats, and Marine dive bombers prioritized visually marked targets. Artillery observers used them to refine barrages. Even naval gunfire controllers directing battleship guns from miles offshore requested that ground units mark targets with anything visible. The technique evolved further. Some units used colored cloth panels, more visible than crayons at greater distances. Others employed paint when available to mark larger structures. But crayons remained popular because they were portable, durable, and required no tools or preparation. A Marine could carry a box in his pocket and deploy it instantly. Post-war, the story faded. The crayon method was not recorded in official histories of the Pacific War. It appeared in no training films, no doctrinal manuals. A few memoirs mentioned it in passing, but without detail or emphasis. Part of the reason was institutional embarrassment. The United States military in 1945 was the most technologically advanced fighting force in history. It had radar, proximity fuses, flamethrower tanks, nuclear weapons in development. Acknowledging that kindergarten crayons had solved a tactical problem was incongruous with that image. But the larger reason was that the innovation came from the bottom. It wasn't a general's brainchild, a staff officer's proposal, or a research program's breakthrough. It was a corporal with a daughter's crayons, a lieutenant desperate enough to try anything, and a chain of Marines willing to risk their lives testing an absurd idea. Institutional militaries struggle to credit such stories. They don't fit the narrative of professional planning and doctrinal excellence. So the crayons disappeared from official memory. but memory persists in unexpected places. Veterans of Iwo Jima and Okinawa carried the story home. Some told their children or grandchildren. A few mentioned it in interviews decades later, usually with a bemused shrug. "Yeah, we used crayons. Crazy, right? But it worked." The technique influenced later developments, though indirectly. After World War II, the military invested heavily in target marking technologies. Smoke rockets with colored payloads, more reliable radio systems, and eventually laser designators and GPS-guided munitions. Each innovation aimed to solve the problem the crayons had addressed, making targets unambiguously visible to supporting arms. In the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, forward air controllers used white phosphorus rockets, Willie Pete, to mark targets for airstrikes. The rockets produced bright white smoke that pilots could see for miles. It was effective but dangerous. Willie Pete burned hot enough to ignite jungle and occasionally caused civilian casualties when it marked the wrong target. Some Vietnam-era Marines, aware of the Iwo Jima crayon story through informal channels, reportedly experimented with colored smoke grenades and even paint to mark Viet Cong bunkers and tunnel entrances. Results were mixed. The jungle environment made visual marking difficult, and the enemy could more easily erase marks than Japanese defenders in reinforced bunkers had. By the 1980s, technology had advanced to the point where physical marking was unnecessary. Laser designators allowed operators to paint targets with invisible infrared beams that guided bombs with meter-level precision. GPS coordinates could direct artillery and airstrikes without any visual reference at all. The crayon method became obsolete, but its legacy persisted in doctrine, the principle that effective combined arms requires unambiguous communication between ground forces and supporting units. Modern Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, JTACs, undergo extensive training in multiple target marking methods, from infrared lasers to digital grid coordinates to, yes, simple visual markers when technology fails. In Iraq and Afghanistan, some special operations units carried colored smoke or infrared strobes to mark targets in environments where radio communication was jammed or compromised. The principle was identical: make the target unmistakably visible. The tools had changed, but the problem remained. And then there's the cultural legacy. In the 21st century, Marines eat crayons became a running joke within and about the corps. The origin of the meme is murky, likely a parody of inter-service rivalry, suggesting Marines are too unsophisticated for complex thought, but it intersected strangely with the true history. Marines did use crayons, not to eat but to kill, and they did it with ingenuity, courage, and effectiveness that saved lives and won battles. Some Marine veterans, aware of the Iwo Jima story, reclaimed the crayon joke. Units began incorporating crayon imagery into unofficial insignia. A few even carried crayons on deployment as good luck charms or historical tributes. In 2019, a Marine veteran named Tashina Coronel founded a clothing company called Crayons Ready to Eat that donated proceeds to veteran causes. The brand embraced the meme while subtly honoring the actual history. Marketing materials occasionally referenced the Pacific War, though most customers probably didn't make the connection. Museums occasionally display artifacts from Iwo Jima: flags, weapons, uniforms. Some include crayons in exhibits, though often without full context. The National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico has a small display mentioning improvised target marking, with a box of period-appropriate Crayola crayons in a case. Few visitors linger there. The display is overshadowed by larger exhibits on Suribachi, the flag raising, the broader Pacific campaign. But for those who know the story, the crayons are the most important artifact in the museum, because they represent something fundamental about warfare. Doctrine and technology matter, but adaptation and human ingenuity matter more. The Marines who marked bunkers on Iwo Jima were not engineers, scientists, or tacticians. They were infantrymen, most barely out of their teens, who saw a problem and found a solution with whatever was at hand. They used children's toys to destroy fortresses, and in doing so, They embodied the core of the Marine Corps ethos: improvise, adapt, overcome. No doctrine anticipated crayons. No training manual suggested them. No general ordered their use. But they worked, and hundreds of Marines came home because of it. That's the story, not the flag raising, not the speeches or medals. The crayons, the absurd, brilliant, life-saving crayons. Warfare is often remembered for its grand strategies and technological marvels. We remember blitzkrieg, aircraft carriers, the atomic bomb. We build monuments to generals and memorialize decisive battles with plaques and statues. But wars are not won by strategies alone. They are won by people, frightened, exhausted, desperate people, who solve problems in real time with whatever tools they have. Sometimes those tools are advanced weaponry. Sometimes they are colored wax sticks meant for drawing pictures. The crayon technique on Iwo Jima was not a miracle. It did not single-handedly win the battle. But it was a reminder that human ingenuity exists at every level of war, not just in planning rooms and laboratories, but in foxholes and volcanic ash, carried by men who have every reason to give up, but don't. Eddie Moran survived Iwo Jima. He went home to Chicago, to his daughter Emma, and never spoke much about the war. He worked as a machinist, raised 3 children, died in 1989. His family didn't know about the crayons until years after his death, when a historian researching Iwo Jima found his name in an after-action report. Emma, his daughter, the one who'd given him the crayons, learned the story in 2003. She was 62 years old. She sat in her kitchen, reading the historian's letter, and cried. She'd thought the crayons were a silly gift, a child's gesture. She'd never imagined they might save lives, might change a battle, might become a story told decades later, but that's the nature of war. Small things ripple outward. A box of crayons, a moment of desperation, a willingness to try something absurd because nothing else was working. The crayons didn't end the war. They didn't make Iwo Jima less brutal or less costly. But they mattered. They gave men a tool when they had none. They turned chaos into precision, even if only for a few bunkers, even if only for a few hours. And in war, that's everything. Somewhere in the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, buried under decades of weathering and erosion, there are still faint marks. Red and orange and yellow, faded now, barely visible. Ghosts of crayons wielded by ghosts of men. They are invisible to tourists who visit the island today, invisible to historians who write about grand strategies and decisive moments. But they are there, markers of ingenuity, markers of survival, markers of the truth that sometimes the simplest tools are the ones that save us, and that is worth remembering. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about courage, ingenuity, and survival. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, France? Our community stretches across the world. You're not just a viewer. You're helping keep these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping history alive.